The 8-bit era of video gaming was an interesting time. It was a period of recovery. It was a step forward into the unknown. It was an improvement to what many people expected in the gaming industry at the time. The days of blips and bloops and pretending that a square moving left and right was a warrior of legend was gone. Real worlds were being crafted. Sprite work that was vibrant represented our obstacles, and some of the greatest franchises, those that you enjoyed as a kid and those your children still enjoy to this day, were manifested during the third generation of gaming. During the third generation, there were two consoles that dominated the market. Nintendo had their Famicom and the NES, and their competitor Sega had the SG-1000 and the Sega Master System. Now, the point of today's episode is to cover the games that were shared between the two systems, and have a good old-fashioned retro gaming showdown between the NES and the SMS. But I won't be doing it alone. I have another wonderful YouTuber, close friend, and video game preservationist working alongside me today to help discuss this interesting topic, JankedJesus. His information will be down in the description below. Now, the NES is something that we all know, especially if you're big on watching my channel. The NES is the console of choice for most of the videos that I make, and I tend to branch out from those videos to include other systems, but in case you didn't know what an NES looks like, it's a gray box with a low insertion force tray for inputs and a power reset button. It outputs video over AV and RF, and the controllers are simple, a D-pad, select and start, with two buttons, B and A.
The Sega Master System, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Physically, it's a much wider system, but it's also a lot less deep, and it actually supports two different forms of media, with both cartridges and cards, which is incredibly unique for a 1980s game console. One of the biggest things that sets it apart is the fact that the pause button isn't on the controller, but on the console itself. Much like the NES, it outputs over AV and RF. But the most interesting thing about the Sega Master System, or at least its first version, the SG-1000, is that it was released on July 15th, 1983.
Wait, that's my day. Yeah, the Famicom and the SG-1000 were released on the same day. That's not something that's discussed often, but it's true. In some ways, that marked the beginning of the console wars, or at least offered an indication of a rivalry that would happen in the future. But that's a topic for another episode. The whole purpose of this is just going to be comparing the two consoles and figuring out the distinctions between how those games were represented.
It goes without saying that Alien was a massively successful movie, and with that comes the absolute undying desire for companies to want to make licensed video games. At least that's what LJN was all about. The first games that revolved around this IP date all the way back to 1982 with Alien on the Atari 2600. Now, both versions of this game specifically were created by Probe Software, which has historically been a bit of a problem child in the gaming industry for making some pretty shitty games, but let's see how they compare.
Now, on the NES, this game has some bopping music. I played it for a little while, and because I've seen the movie, I kind of understood the plot, right? We have Ripley running around trying to save prisoners while avoiding a biblical amount of xenomorphs with limited ammunition, fall damage, and exceptionally slippery controls. Between me and you, I've never actually made it past level 1 without losing a life. It's that silly when it comes to game design. We also have an exceptionally shitty time pressure that barely affords you the opportunity to find the prisoners.
However, on Master System, this game was only released in Europe, and it plays very similar to the NES version, but it's actually kind of better. Our character moves a little bit more fluidly, and while there are still elements in the game that can kick rocks, like the Xenomorph's hitbox, the fall damage, and that stupid timer, from a gameplay perspective, I think this one is quite a bit better. We have more access to the prisoners, and it doesn't feel as much like a wild trial and error maze, and I don't know, I think Sega won this one.
Alien Syndrome originated in the arcades in the late 80s. It's a Sega game that magically found itself on the NES and the SMS. Now, when it came time to port it, it was done by the same company, Sanritsu, but the aesthetics of the two are exceptionally different. But before we get there, let's talk about the purpose of the game. This is a run and gun, and it's a fairly straightforward one. We have Ricky and Mary. They go through 7 different ships rescuing their comrades, and then they take on a level guardian. After level 7, it loops indefinitely.
One of the interesting things about the Sega Master System is that it afforded Sega the opportunity to port their arcade games to their own home console, and Alien Syndrome was massively successful, which is likely the only reason why it ended up on both systems. But what I can say is that the Sega Master System couldn't really handle the level transitions like we'd see in the arcades. The way it's presented, we enter the stage and we can walk around freely trying to find our friends. But it's screen by screen on the Master System, which can kind of throw you off if you're trying to remember where you are. They did a fairly decent job of translating the aesthetic of the arcade game, though.
The NES version, however, did manage to figure out how to do the full room transitions flawlessly, so to me, it does a better job of being a home port. Visually though, that's where it struggles, among many other things. When I played the NES version, I noticed that the clean looking graphics were pushed to the wayside, and we have like a sepia tone covering the screen. It's very NES styled, if that makes sense, and with that comes the questionable hitboxes, right? Especially on the level guardians. To be honest, this one is a toss-up. If you want a more efficient screen transition, check out the NES version, but if you want more arcade accuracy, I'd say play the SMS version.
TV shows make great video games, said nobody ever, right? But it was a tried and true process that LJN and Acclaim both swore by, and because of that, there were tons of games in the 80s that aligned with swooping down and picking up licenses. More often than not, though, those games lie in infamy for being absolutely terrible. They relied on people having interest in a culturally relevant topic, and once you bought it, they made their money, so screw you, kid. What are you gonna do, bring it back? Nope. You had that game, it was your choice, you made it, and now you're the proud owner of Back to the Future 2 and 3, which, guess what? It's on this list as well. But there were two shared Simpsons games on the NES and the Sega Master System, and this one is Bart vs. the Space Mutants.
This game made no fucking sense to me. I understand the principle. There's some aliens dropping down, invading Springfield, turning things purple, and taking them back. So Bart, being the fuckwagon he is, he needs to make things not be purple. And that involves finding red spray paint to turn all of the purple objects red. Now you would think that would be easy, right? No. Bart controls like an Abrams tank stuck in 500 feet of mud, and he can only take 2 hits before dying. This game is trial and error 101, and I cannot stand it. We find multiple objects to remove the purple items, but good fucking luck getting them because of the horrible jump mechanic.
I gotta say, visually, this is impressive. I mean, even this opening screen of the game has a more realistic looking Simpsons scene, right? Like it's ripped straight from the TV show. This is also a European exclusive, which we gotta stop for a second. It doesn't make any sense to me. Because The Simpsons was an American show first and foremost, so why not put it out on the Master System in America, like only in Europe? It's almost like Sega wanted the Master System to fail in the United States. Now, gameplay-wise on the Master System, it is pretty much the same experience as the NES, although there's a big caveat when it comes to the controls. In the NES version, you can select your items by just hitting the select button, and then you use it with the start button. But on the Master System, there is no real select or start button, so to get around that, you actually have to change objects by holding the down button on the Master System control pad, and then you press 2 to activate the object. It's much less convenient.
I played both of these for a little bit, and I couldn't jump over the enemy no matter how much I tried. I would always get tagged by the hitbox on the SMS version, so as much as it pains me, and let me tell you, it pains me, I have to give it to the NES because it's actually playable. But don't get it twisted, this is much like asking what color hammer I'd like to be smacked in the nuts with. They both hurt, but hey, that blue hammer, it's a very pretty color. Speaking of choosing which hammer you'd want to get hit in the nuts with, let's move on to Bart vs. the World, another attempt to make The Simpsons stand out in the home video game market. Bart vs. the Space Mutants was essentially an adventure game, but Bart vs. the World, it's just a compilation of nonsense. Between both games, our objective is to find certain objects to unlock future levels, for example, crusty souvenirs, which supposedly are the best items to find. I guess it's mandatory. You'll find these weird sub-levels, each with their own gimmick, be it a slider puzzle, a scavenger hunt, a tile matching game. You get it.
Well, this is vibrant, but yet again, it is another Master System European exclusive. I'm honestly starting to think that like Nintendo or even Acclaim had some like under-the-table deal for exclusive rights for publishing Sega's versions in Europe and the NES versions in the US. For those that don't know, if you see Flying Edge as a publisher, that's actually Acclaim, as is Arena, and finally LJN, at least in the 90s when they were acquired. The two games are pretty much the same, but honestly, it's infuriating to figure out where to go or what to do. The skateboarding level is the worst, because even if you're lined up with the crusty heads that you're supposed to obtain, the hitbox doesn't even detect it. So yeah, it's a rough time.
I fundamentally hold a tremendous amount of disdain for this game. I know what they were trying to do, but I cannot for the life of me figure out why they did it. I mean, I can assume why, something to do with a little green piece of paper coming in by the droves, but playing this is a chore. An absolute chore! Bart controls horribly, he can barely jump, and the mini-games get old rather quickly. But hey, at least we have the actual Simpsons theme song in it. That's something that the Sega Master System version can't claim. It's another case of the hammer, right? The SMS version looks a little bit better, and I have to concede on this one.
Oh boy, this is gonna be a bit of a rough one, guys. Historically, Back to the Future, I think, was not given the proper care and attention when it came to the licensed video game adaptations. Obviously, it's a popular movie trilogy that most of us quote even to this day. You know, I talk about Doc Brown and roads where we're going, we don't need roads all the time. You know, it's huge in pop culture, or at least it was back then. I would say it still is now, but the powers that be decided to make a video game out of it, of course, and at least on the NES, it's known for being horrible. But let's let Fortefyre give you some insight into it.
Oh great, passing me the proverbial bowl of bullshit, huh? Back to the Future on the NES had two specific games, Back to the Future and then a double up for parts 2 and 3. But the Sega Master System only had parts 2 and 3, and they were separate games. So when it comes time to check out the SMS version, it will effectively be two different games. Now if you've watched my content before, you already know where this is going. This is hands down one of my least favorite games on the NES. It's a bastardization of the IP, and it's an abhorrent mistake of humanity. We slog around trying to make sense of the buffoonery that surrounds us, and we constantly die. Yay, end scene. Chalk it up to the absolute chuckle fucks that Beam Software are.
Oh, but how about yet another European exclusive? Oh, and Brazil had it too, believe it or not. I don't understand it, but what I do understand is that the key developer here is ImageWorks, a kind of company that in many ways is the embodiment of, oh, my buddy does tattoos. He did this one, and they show you a jagged, misshapen abomination that'll be there for the rest of their lives. They scrub the bottom of the barrel. But before we get too far, let's take a look at how the games actually look. It's gotta be better than what Beam Software did, yeah? Now in Back to the Future 2, we actually see some pretty dope artwork. I mean, yeah, this is like looking good so far, and then you actually start to play it. The controls are extremely stiff. There's nonsense coming in from every direction. Even forward momentum is a chore. The hitboxes are horrible. Oh my gosh, they are actually dreadful. We lose our lives so easily, and it's from literally everything. We have cars trying to run us over, potholes, oil slicks, sentient fire hydrants, RC cars, old people. Everything kills you, and you only get like 5 lives to figure it out. Let's just move on to 3. Maybe we can salvage some point for the Master System. Nope, not even going to talk about it. Unfortunately, there isn't really a good version of this in the 8-bit world, and nobody's getting this point. It's that bad.
Oh, thank God. Okay, whew. I thought this whole list was just going to be butthole movie adaptations. I actually really like Bubble Bobble. Taito is a legacy arcade company, and this was one of their first majorly successful games. It even kickstarted a little franchise that still exists to this day in some capacity. It's always been a very approachable and easy to play game in my opinion, and a fun one at that. Just blow bubbles, trap the enemy, pop the bubble. It's repetitive, but that's okay. This is an arcade game. But the question is, which version is better? This was a huge game internationally for Taito, including the arcade version. It was ported 16 times, and on the NES alone, there were 8 different releases. In America, we obviously only saw 1, but Taito broke it down a little bit for the European releases, which I don't tend to cover here. Gameplay-wise, this is one of those games that contend with the sprite flicker that the NES is famous for. We just have too many objects to render at once, and that's okay. That flicker protects the game flow, opens memory for the game to run, and honestly, it's a good time. I enjoy this one.
But the Master System version is a different beast entirely. For the rest of the world, it was known as Final Bubble Bobble, Dragon Maze, or just Bubble Bobble. But what sets it apart is that much like the other Master System games, the visual appeal is amazing. It looks pretty close to arcade quality, and guess what? Instead of the arcade's 100 levels, we actually get 200 levels. So if you love Bubble Bobble, you have so much more replayability, and for many that was a make or break. Because of that, I think that the Sega Master System version is simply the better version in this case. Well, that happiness was short-lived. You know, there are games out there sometimes that are just really notorious for honestly being subpar. In fact, if you'll take a journey with me here for a second, imagine a ship, okay? It's called the USS video game industry. And depending on who's at the wheel, we may move forward, sometimes we'll move backwards. But if you let a company like Epix control the ship, you just stay in the same spot, bouncing up and down with the waves, while a goofy developer spins the wheel around, laughing, wearing a Cracker Jack hat, saying, "Look at me, I'm captain now. Ship go fast." Epic released a line of games known as the Game series, and while it might sound stupid, it honestly worked. It had titles like Winter Games, Summer Games, World Games, and in this case, California Games. And for starters, California Games does look fairly decent. But don't let that fool you. The Master System had a very vivid palette, and it makes even the worst games stand out visually. The key issue here is simply that Epix made bad games, and in this case, it was a mistake they repeated quite often. Why? Because this originated for the computer industry. California Games itself was originally made for the Apple II, and believe it or not, it was a pack-in for the Atari Lynx. And if you grew up in an era where this game existed, you may have liked it. It was a commercial success, but to be honest, it didn't translate well to the Master System well at all. It's simply a product of its time.
Yeah, Epix, like Kyle said, this is a well-known example of taking gaming for the computers and attempting to port it to the home consoles, and usually it wasn't done well, at all. Now don't get me wrong, mad props to the computer aspect of this game's history, but the fact remains that PC gaming was behind home consoles for a little while. The ZX Spectrum had nothing on the NES, the Commodore 64, however, was more of a contender, but people still struggled to release quality games. It wasn't until the late 80s where computer games started really having an identity. Personally for me, the Amiga is an excellent point of reference for games that I actually tolerate. Now California Games, I don't like it. And between all of the numerous releases, it's not good. And nothing is going to change that. No matter what you do, you're going to contend with a horrible control scheme that has a very distinct learning curve to it. And even then, you always win the game. You will always be in first place if you play alone, period. To me, this is a matter of preference between NES and SMS, whatever you owned at the time. It's a bad game. I'm not going to pretend that it's fun, because it isn't. I was born in 1992, and for the life of me, I don't recall anything relevant to Crash Test Dummies. I don't remember TV shows, I don't remember the toys, and I certainly wasn't old enough to understand PSAs, right? So up until the AVGN released his episode about it, I didn't know about it. But for anyone who wants a quick catch-up, David McDonald and Jim Bryn created a line of toys that aligned with a popular series of PSAs back in the day. Tyco Toys picked it up, and for those who remember it, they were pretty innovative. In 1993, there was a show on Fox Kids. Because it was a show, the unholy triumvirate was destined to pick it up. In this case, it's Acclaim and LJN. The NES version is simple but annoying. Aesthetically, it isn't the worst, but it's definitely another throwaway from Software Creations. But hey, we get music from Jeff Fallen. That's something to brag about. In the game, we go through 27 stages dodging stupid obstacles that barely change, with insane knockback physics if we get hit. And throughout the game, we get to control the Crash Test Dummies. I'm sure if I sat down that I could make it through this, but it really wouldn't be a fun time.
On the Sega Master System, Crash Dummies is a completely different game. In fact, we don't have to worry about endless platforming. Instead, we're just doing our job as the dummies, which is awesome. We do tons of stunts to make money, which to me is interesting because that's what they did in the show. and as a PSA. Day 1, we jump off a roof with the intention of crashing through as many obstacles as we can. Day 2 is a racing minigame where you pick up air cans, cash, and eventually crash into a finish line wall. And all in all, there's only 5 stages before the game repeats with a slightly higher difficulty. It's easy, but don't get me wrong, it can be challenging because of the limitations of the system. But if you stack the two together, I think I gotta go with the Master System version on this one. Oh boy, Wiener Tracy, the crack detective, a major comic strip turned movie turned video game turned irrelevant rather quickly too. And you know what's funny? It's still running to this day. It's just not relevant like it was back then. Now, Dick Tracy received a few different variations. There was an NES and Game Boy version that was designed by Real Time Associates. There was a Genesis and Master System version from Sega. Titus released a few computer versions, 2 of which were for DOS. It's a wild mishmash of ideas. But I'll be honest with y'all, from first impressions, this is actually pretty cool. It reminds me a bit of the Punisher on NES, where we walk to the right and shoot enemies as they show up. In fact, everyone's an enemy. Dick Tracy is a sociopathic murderer. Holy shit, he shoots everyone. We can also punch people if they get too close, which is probably the more moral thing to do, but it is what it is. The game gave me a gun, and it doesn't penalize me for using it, so cowabunga it is. The problem is we lose the gun in level 2, and from that point on, the game goes downhill real fast. We simply just can't stand hand-to-hand with the enemies. They absolutely decimate us, or throw cans at us. I mean, very lethal cans.
The NES version is one of those movie games that people tend to judge based on word of mouth. To many people, this is just a bad game from a buzzword ideology, and you bought it, so fuck you! Go on with your life. Not me though. When I play this, I see a pretty decent game where we have a clear-cut objective of using deductive reasoning to drive to places while dodging Fallujah levels of snipers, and once we enter the building, it's a platformer. It's not a bad game, and honestly, you should check it out. To me, it's more playable than the SMS version.
It would be very hard to overstate the importance of Double Dragon. To me, it was one of the first games to make the beat-em-up genre work. It isn't genre-defining, but it is genre-enhancing. And because of it, a beat-em-up frenzy began that was perfected by Streets of Rage 2. True story, but who did it better? Let's check it out.
Double Dragon on the NES is a rite of passage game, right? We all know the sounds of it and we know what it looks like. We know where the franchise goes. Remember Bimmy and Jimmy? Yeah, great guys, Bimmy and Jimmy. Now, I don't think it's fair to talk about this game unless I actually check out the arcade version, so I did. Previously, I hadn't played it, so what's the verdict? I'm impressed. I could see how this game would be appealing to folks. It's a solid beat 'em up, and when it came time to port it, Technos did a phenomenal job. You know, I used to think that this was archaic and rough, but honestly, when push comes to shove, this is a pretty fucking good port of this. The one big difference is that we don't have immediate access to all of our moves. We have to earn them by beating enemies. We have to level up, unless of course you use that exploit in level 2, which I do every single time. The only thing I really hate about this game comes near the end where we deal with an abhorrent RNG for a wall. Other than that, it's solid.
Now, the Master System version is quite faithful to the arcade, and in contrast to the NES, we do have all of our moves, which is quite interesting. Another thing to note, though, is how difficult this one is. If you know anything about the NES, it has that sprite flicker, right? Well, this also exists on the Master System. It's just one of those 8-bit things that you kind of have to get used to, but still, it's pretty rough in this one. Sometimes we'll have enemies stack up, and if that happens, you don't know if you're hitting the enemy, and even getting close to the enemy is tough because of how aggressive they are. Imagine like 3 dudes all jump kicking you at the same time. It's just not practical, and I feel like many people would probably move past this one pretty quick. I gotta say, I think the NES might have this one. And with that, that's the first 10 games here with the NES and Master System comparison. We have Many, many more to go, but I think that's quite enough for today. Do you guys remember any of these games? Did you happen to maybe live in Europe or Brazil and get to play some of these Master System versions? These are all things that the comment section is great for. A chance to share memories with each other, maybe even brag about the score so far, which, as a reminder, the Master System is winning by 1 whole point.
And of course, if you did watch this video to completion, you're already home in our community. We're a group of video gaming enthusiasts who just enjoy remembering when life was just a little bit easier to live, and we're beginning our journey to 8,000 subscribers. So if you want to join this incredible journey and an even more phenomenal community, feel free to do so. I'd love to have you here. I do want to say thank you to Kyle for taking the time to work on this episode with me, and if you want to check out more of his work either on Twitch or YouTube, his information will be down below. Who do you think's going to win this one? We got a lot more episodes coming, only time will tell. Before you go, if you don't mind, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.